Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the Democracy of Jewelry panel discussion. My name is Jill Allen, and I'm the exhibitions coordinator for the Alberta Craft Council. I would like to begin by acknowledging that Alberta is home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit whose footsteps have marked these lands for generations. Today, we are joining you from the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. All of us are beneficiaries of these treaties. The Alberta Craft Council is dedicated to ensuring that the spirit of these treaties are honored and respected in the work we do to support, promote, and advocate for Alberta's craft artists. All right. Thanks once again for joining us today, especially all our folks online and of course our wonderful audience members here in person. I'd like to take a moment to introduce our panelists, and while I do that, I'm going to share my screen and show you some images of their work. So just be 1 second to get that set up. Carrie Wu, who curated the exhibition and is also showing her work, is a 2003 graduate from the Jewellery and Metal programs at the Alberta College of Art and Design, which is now the Alberta University of the Arts. Carrie is an experienced and committed craft community organizer and volunteer who advocates for the handmade economy. She is a recent recipient of the Alberta Craft Council 2021 Tom McFall Honor Award. Also joining us today is Lindsay Rice. Lindsay is an assistant professor in the Jewellery and Metals program at Alberta University of the Arts. She received a BFA in Jewellery and Metalsmithing from the University of Wisconsin at Milwaukee in 2006, and her MFA in Jewellery and Metalsmithing from the University of Oregon in 2012. Joining us from Vancouver via Zoom link is Louise Perron. Louise holds a Bachelor of Art in Sculpture from the Nottingham Trent University in the UK and a postgraduate certificate in Art and Design Education from the University of Brighton. In 2002, Perron graduated from the Alberta College of Art and Design with a Bachelor of Fine Arts in Jewellery and Metal. Our next panelist, Sarah Alford, currently teaches craft history and theory at the Alberta University of the Arts. She has an undergraduate degree in jewellery, metalsmithing, and art history from the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design University from 2004, and was awarded a Fulbright to attend the School of Art Institute of Chicago, where she earned an MA in Visual and Critical Studies, 2009, and an MFA in Studio through the Department of Fiber and Material Studies, 2010. Alfred earned her PhD in art history and art conservation at Queen's University in Kingston. Also participating today, Devon Clark began her training at the Kootenay School of the Arts Centre for Craft and Design in Nelson, British Columbia, where she completed a 3-year diploma program in the Jewellery and Small Object Design Department in 1999. She continued her education at the Alberta College of Art and Design, where she received a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree in Jewellery and Metals, 2002. Oops. Jamie Kroger, the final of the 6 artists participating in the exhibition, is unfortunately unable to join us today. Jamie graduated from the Alberta College of Art and Design Jewellery and Metals program with a BFA in 2017 and completed a Master's of Fine Arts in Medium and Material-Based Studies in 2019 at the Kunstskolen Oslo, Norway. Jamie is currently a sessional faculty member in the Jewellery and Metals Department at the Alberta University of the Arts. I'm just realizing now, I forgot to mention, Lindsay, that you're also teaching at the Alberta University of the Arts as an associate professor in the Jewellery and Metals program. All right. So, Carrie, you're the curator of the Democracy of Jewelry exhibition, and I was hoping that you could tell our audience a little bit about the inspiration for the exhibition and your ideas that you're hoping that come across in the Democracy of Jewelry.
Sure, I'd be glad to. The impetus for this exhibition began more as a question, a curiosity, and was sparked by a moment when I was standing in a toy store with my son and found a shelf full of DIY jewelry craft kits. And so the question began more of the self-reflection about where my practice fit into the broader field of jewelry practice and the spaces that I inhabit, which is also, I also have a mixed media practice. And this turned into wondering about how my colleagues were approaching similar questions. With the accessibility to materials and information, the rise of the DIY crafter, the hobby makers, Instagram stars, and the ubiquitousness of the internet, I was realizing that all of these influences yield a very broad handmade marketplace. And so in a sense, it was a bit of an identity crisis. And so, and then also considering the Canadian contemporary art jewelry scene in Canada is quite young and still developing here, I feel, relative to other places internationally, but there's a healthy and vibrant community of active makers. And so, you'll see through this exhibition that the boundaries of the idea of jewelry are quite lucid, and the influences that we draw from come from every direction, including traditional skill bases. And so it was really, I wanted to survey what contemporary makers in this region how they would respond to this kind of question, and wondering and where they were at with their practices. So that's how it began.
All right. I'm going to share a short video I made of the exhibition downstairs, just so that folks who can't be in person are able to see what everything looks like. So this exhibition is currently on at our Calgary location gallery. It's up until the 5th of March. If you are in the region and you're able to come and see it, I urge you to do that. We do have images on our website of the works in the exhibition, and we'll have some images of the installation as well posted in the near future. So if you're not able to come and see it, you can see it on our website. Hopefully this will just give you an idea of how the show's laid out. Carrie, maybe we could talk a little bit about your ideas around the value of materials and how that plays into the exhibition themes.
Mm-hmm. So when you're approaching jewelry making from a traditional point of view, of course, there's a fairly limited realm of materials that one can draw from. But most of my colleagues, all of my colleagues in this exhibition, and then in my life professionally, have more of an arts background, and so the boundaries or the breadth of material and the depth of material is much broader, and in an overconsumptive society, where we've got so much throwaway culture, that's also fascinating to me. And I know a lot of people who use materials that would be throwaway or considered garbage. They create precious, beautiful objects. So it changes the value of those materials inherently. And I'm fascinated by that. I do that in my own work, but I see this becoming more and more a response to not only the cost of materials, but also just as a response to our living, to being, in this Anthropocene era of the 21st century. And, there's so much material that has use beyond what it was made for. So that I'm always thinking about that. And the women who were included in this exhibition were already doing that in their practices. And so that's why they came to mind when I was thinking about the invitations for this exhibition. And I think that they all do that. They take a material that might be just overlooked, or that you wouldn't even take a second look at if it hadn't been transformed by their hand and their skills and their thoughts and their labor. Yeah.
Sarah, do you have a few words to share about that idea of value as well? I loved your statement for the exhibition. And if you wouldn't mind talking a bit about what the artist brings to the value of an object?
Oh, sure, thanks. Yeah, one of the materials that I use in this exhibition, and I've been working with it for a long time, is hot glue, which is like a hobbyist material that you find. A friend of mine once described that she said, oh, you go shopping for your jewelry supplies in basically stores that are organized landfill, which kind of Carrie said. I'm like, yeah, true. But I was thinking about the kind of hierarchies in a similar way that Carrie was, about between the fine art crafts education that I was getting, and kind of where and hobbyist craft. And so I was thinking, oh, there's a hierarchy there, and I kind of wonder what that's all about. But I was also really interested in this idea of craft as this process of transformation in and of itself. So I was like, oh, I've described it like this before, but I think of crafting as this practical act of metaphor, where there's kind of you on one side and then the material on your other, and in between your labor, you come together to become more than you were. Clay becomes like something you can drink from, and threads become a coat, and a stone becomes a star. So I was thinking about these same materials and about that process of labor, and hot glue came up for a project or just a memory of something. And so I started to work with it in the jewelry studio, and I spent a long time with it and realized that kind of the more time and affection and the more I got to know it, the more it kind of shone for me. And we went through that same process that these traditional materials go through. And I became really attached to its flexibility and its shine. And yeah, it's just like hot glue is this very hardworking, invisible, maligned material. But when you make entire pieces out of it, it just has its moment, and I think, oh, that's me too. It does that for me too. So I guess that process and that, it just allows an experience that I think of inherent to craft in and of itself. Anyway, hot glue, yeah, it's great. I've been working with it since 2002, so we've gotten to know each other pretty well.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Louise, maybe I could ask you to talk a little bit about the textile materials that you use in your work and how that relates to the themes in the show of value of materials and status.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, and I'm just going to spotlight you. There we go. All right, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. I wish I was there with you. It's really hard to see everyone there, and I was really excited about the idea of doing this panel. So anyway, next time I'll come. So the question about my materials. So I started using fabric when my children were really small, as a way of continuing my jewelry practice without having access to a studio all the time to concentrate at long periods of time. And I before I was making textile jewelry, I was using anodized aluminum. So the fabrics I chose were, I was looking for the colors and the luster of that anodized aluminum. And I started out using, I found ties from the thrift store, men's neckties. And I also didn't have a lot of money at that time to spend on materials. So the sustainability of my work comes partly out of financial things, as well as not creating waste. And as I sit here in my own studio, yesterday I was sorting out all these pieces that I've made that I still have that have not sold. And I was looking at all these products that I've produced and put out into the world, and I still have them. And I was just, one saving grace of that is that it's not anything extra. I've taken something that was waste and made it into something useful, beautiful, interesting, has a message. So I think using raw materials for me at this stage in the world would feel quite problematic. What was the second part of your question? Am I answering this?
Yeah, I was just also thinking about denim and jeans and how they relate to status in society.
Oh, so with the denim work, which is what's in the show, I started working with jeans. I was thinking about the idea of heirloom jewelry and things being passed down, and how they become more valuable just from the very nature of belonging to someone else and being passed on to you as an heirloom. And I'm sure Sarah could talk about the word heirloom and the where that word comes from and how it relates to textiles, but that's whole nother thing. Jeans, I was thinking about like the boyfriend jean, the mom jean, the jeans that the fabric becomes, the garment becomes more valuable, more interesting, more fashionable, the more it's worn and distressed. And then the fashion industry picks up on that and starts artificially distressing jeans. There's also, jeans started out as a workwear for people during the gold rush and timber industry, and they've been adopted by different classes, different types of people, different cultural groups, and to the point where in the 1970s we started to get designer jeans. So there's this whole across the world at any one time, it's a ridiculous number of people are wearing jeans. It's the most ubiquitous item of clothing in the world. And there's all kinds of statistics about how many jeans the average North American woman owns, which is quite a lot. And the process of making that garment is very detrimental to the environment. So much water used. The process of distressing jeans artificially is horrible for the health of the workers in the factories, although there are some companies now trying to address that. But the cheap jeans that you're going to get are made in a really unethical way. So these pieces, I'm unpicking this. The process starts with me unpicking all the labor of the person who made those jeans and removing it. And I think that the act of doing that is a comment on how we just ignore the labor that went into the products that we buy. And then I'm selecting the fabric based on the marks in the jeans and referencing jewelry objects through that. And then the value, like Carrie was saying, is in my hand sewing, but it's also a commentary on whose labor is valuable and whose isn't. And for me as a white artist in North America, I can dare to charge a lot of money for my labor, where other people aren't afforded that privilege.
Thanks, Louise.
Thank you.
Lindsay, can you talk a little bit about your work around status and ritual and heraldry and how that relates to the themes in the Democracy of Jewelry show?
I hate to go after Louise. I think that there's something for me that's really interesting, just hearing Carrie kind of reiterate what she was thinking about at the inception of the exhibition, and those ideas of access to labor, or like access to like easy labor, and like simplification, and simplification of making, kind of like undermining this like process of like traditional making we all went through. But I also feel that that access, or that like democratization of material changes like not only what we can use in our work, but it also changes the way that people like access labor as well. So it can kind of elevate us to a different status or a different place. And I think that idea of like everyone being able to make is really interesting. Like I started out like working at a bead store, you know, so I think you can like become a craftsperson from like many angles, and that kind of DIY access is really interesting. And then yeah, I guess with my practice or my work in relationship to the exhibition, my kind of mentality and like pedagogically as well is like, if you can if you can make it relate to the body, then it counts as jewelry. And so that kind of opens the world to like any material, any scale. You know, like Sarah and I were talking the other day about like the potential of architecture as wearable. And so I think that there's a freedom in this particular craft medium for me, because it, you know, it isn't, I'm not the media, or like not speaking down about any other craft medium, but it isn't clay, and you know, so clay you need to make in clay, right? With jewelry, if it relates again to the body, then it can be, you can magpie anything together, which I guess, yeah, magpieing is definitely the premise of my practice. So a lot of my materials come from traditionally like masculine sources, like, you know, fly fishing stores, or like hardware stores. And then the juxtaposition of that with like my hoarding of sequins from really cheap places like Walmart, to try to make, like, to elevate these materials and also speak to ideas of like traditional ornamentation culturally. Did I answer your question? Yeah. I feel like I started going on this tangent. I'm just like hearing everyone else talk, and just, I'm really excited right now. I haven't been in this, like, I haven't been in an environment where we're talking about ideas for like years now. So this is really lovely.
Well, I'm glad it's exciting. Devin, maybe we could hear a little bit from you.
I forgot to take my mask off.
Yes, I keep forgetting to take my mask off. The question I have written down for you is, do the cast-off objects recycle themselves as talismans or receptacles of memory? And how does this flip-flop of value relate to the themes in the show?
So the objects that I used in my work when we're discussing mass production and the availability of DIY kits in craft stores, the objects I used are probably more widely mass produced and used regularly in everyday life than the objects that you would find in a DIY jewelry kit. And those objects are definitely more assembling style pieces. So I used bread tags, I used fortunes from a fortune cookie that came out of a dinner I had experienced. And the other object is a dry cleaning tag that would come off of clothes that are dry cleaned. So for me, those objects, the value comes in the story and the emotion that's attached to those objects. They were from a very, I would say, difficult time in my life where I was going through a separation. And so those objects, for me, started as a receptacle of memory. Because obviously when you're ending something, you have a grief and a situation to overcome. And as those things change, those pieces have actually now become talismans, in the sense that you move on from something that you've experienced in your life and you change and you grow. So they started as a receptacle of memory, and then they sort of became more of a talisman. And what's interesting about these pieces is because they're sort of more of an assemblage, they can change. So whether those objects come back to me, the bread tags can come off and new ones can go on, or something else can go on. And because they all have expiry dates on the tags, the timeline of that story can change. And same thing with the fortunes. It was very specific to a certain period, but those fortunes can change if a new one goes on. So whether those jewelry pieces come back to me, I can continue to change the story, and the talisman and the power of those objects can change. But if those objects go on to someone else, then that connection of story, that's where the value of those pieces comes in, and the concept of art and just connection to people, why we gravitate towards certain pieces, that's where the value is. And then that story can change if someone decides to change, because technically everything on those pieces is removable. It can be changed by whoever wears them. So I don't know if that answers that.
It does, for sure. And I really love the idea of those objects that you use that are recognizable to lots of people and hold different meanings for the audience as well. It doesn't necessarily have to be that you are hammering a message across with the message that you have, but there are ways for the audience and the viewer to connect with those objects as well on their own experience. So.
Yeah, so they're sort of interactive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's great. So Jamie Kroger wasn't able to be with us today. Carrie and I are going to talk a bit about Jamie's work, and hoping Lindsay will jump in and help, because I know Jamie's a colleague and also a student. Is that correct? She was a student of yours?
I don't think I can take any credit for Jamie. She was in her last year when I was in my first year of teaching. So yeah, Jamie was my student.
You were probably an influence.
Yeah.
So Carrie, if it's okay with you, I will ask a question, and then Jamie's provided us with her thoughts on these questions, and Carrie will read out what Jamie's provided us with. So the question is, how does a place or even a time shift the value of something? In your statement, you talk about the value of usefulness, safety, and comfort over the preciousness of mainstream jewelry materials, and use enamel to highlight important aspects of each piece, i.e. the connections.
So, and I'd like to thank Jamie for providing the information or the answers to these questions for us. And I'm just going to read them word for word so I don't misspeak at all. So Jamie says, I think it all comes down to sentimentality and the way that place makes you feel. It's not about even just one place, but all the components, moments, experience, and people that contribute to the value of every part of it, which are also attributes found in jewelry. In building the water hauler piece, I spent a lot of time thinking about these relationships between human, place, and objects. And it gave me the opportunity to reminisce about the objects that I find most valuable. In the past, I spent a lot of time working in the national park backcountry with the horses and staying in the warden cabins. The days were long and often uncomfortable. There were with bad weather and that feeling of never knowing what could happen next. However, there were certain simple components of the experience that could bring a person a high level of comfort. A familiar vista, your favorite mug in the cabin, or the water yoke that hung on the same nail in the corner since the beginning of time. I think these objects and moments represented a sense of routine and familiarity in a job and location that could throw all the wild variables at you at any point in the day.
And maybe I'll just ask the other question as well.
Sure.
In contrast to what is valued in the place that you live in, the pieces themselves are not very functional as tools or for safety or comfort. But how or why do you draw on such things for inspiration?
So in response, Jamie says, the pieces that I make or the components that they are made of often allude to equipment, tools, or safety gear, but are completely non-functional. If you actually try to use them as much, and the gear and equipment has been a huge part of my life, definitely playing a bigger part in my existence than jewelry or ornamentation. Like jewelry, they portrayed my character, who I am, and what I like. For many years, I wore an avalanche transceiver as religiously as a wedding ring, and climbing equipment or tree falling equipment as commonly as a belt. My tribute to them as non-functional jewelry items maybe is an attestation to the fact that in real life, this collection of equipment is still just a collection of objects. As an object, they have the potential to make you slightly safer, but it is the human decision in how they are used that is the real contributing factor to getting the job done and coming home at the end of the day. I use fabrication processes such as hollow form construction to represent some of these reliances to object. Material choice is a major factor to express this narrative as well. Rusted steel has the potential to represent a change in relationship to place or object over time. Enamel is used as a metaphor to explain the preciousness of certain relationships or connections, but also to express the time and patience required to gain experience in everything we do and the relationships we are seeking out. Enameling is such a humbling experience. Just when you think you might know what you are doing and you push yourself technically, some external force, such as having the power go out and the kiln die in the middle of a fire, will put you in your place. As frustrating as it can be, I love this about the material and the process. We all know that moment.
I think we can all relate to that.
Yeah.
Yes. So I'd like to open up to our panelists and these on the Zoom. If you have any questions for each other that you'd like to ask or discuss, otherwise we'll go to the audience. Does anybody want to say anything else?
I was sort of curious, I guess, about Carrie, about your work in the show, the relationship between you mentioned the shrinky dink kits, and then kind of what you did with the portraits and the way,
Right.
in that relationship, another relationship with the body almost.
Yes, thank you. So the work that I've included in the exhibition, I actually used the material that was in that original DIY kit that I found, and if you remember from, I don't know, 70s or 80s, shrinky dinks, or shrink film, as it's more technically known as. I transferred images onto these shrink films and turned the images, or included the images in jewelry objects. And so I kind of continued on a vein. I've been working in for a number of years using photographs as the impetus for the pieces. And the one piece that has my grandmother's and mother's images on it, and its relationship to the body, that material is absolutely transformed in the wearing of the object, but also the other materials. I use seeds from my grandmother's garden and fabric from the remnants that I inherited from her. And so the big question I have, at the base of all of that work is about kind of identity and what makes us who we are. And as I think everybody, I'm echoing everybody here and Jamie's work, these moments and all these influences that are cumulative in who we are and who we become. And so the pieces in the exhibition are an expression of that, distilled expressions of that. In another piece, I used an image of, I found an analog map book. I know my nephew, who's 16, he saw a map for the first time in his life, like a paper map, like 2 years ago, which is crazy to me. But I found an analog map book, and I found it was of the city of Calgary, and I found all of these significant locations of really impactful experiences from my life. And so I used, and then in the pieces, when you're on a trail and you have like you are here, like the screw that screwed into the metal sign, it's like you are here. I added a rivet to all those points in time and place that impactful experiences happened. And I often think about those moments, and it's like how they've impacted and created patterns of behavior, patterns of response, or perception in my life. And so that piece is called a route map. And using that material enabled me to translate that image, where when you actually buy a DIY kit, it comes with images already provided for you. And so I kind of co-opted that material and made it my own in this process. Yeah. So if that speaks a little bit to it. Yeah. Thank you for asking.
Yeah.
Does anybody else have a question? Louise, do you have any questions? No? That's okay. So I think I'd like to turn to the audience now to see if anyone is dying to ask a question. I'm sure our panelists would be happy to answer you. And of course, out in the Zoom audience, you're welcome to type a question in the chat for us, and we'll be happy to share that with the group here and get your question answered. Is there anyone from the audience who'd like to speak? Yes.
I'm not quite sure if it's a question, but Devin was talking about mass production, things like red tape, what would it consider mass production? What would it consider so I don't know if that just reminded me that all the things that have been interactive or they like technology.
I'm not sure we were able to hear you on the Zoom. Is it possible that you could come a bit closer to the mic? Sorry to put you on the spot. You don't have to be by the camera. Just, yeah, probably that's good, that's good.
Okay. It was not so much a question as it was a thinking point that came to my mind,
Okay.
which was that the mass production of objects that Denim is using in her work was bread takes and fortunes and dry cleaning takes, and that reminded me of how mass production in previous centuries depended on what was being used. So pins and buttons were all the things that we put together for clothes with, and we find them tossed aside and in the garbage, and we find them in the Thames from centuries past. So what are people going to find centuries from now? Bread takes and those kind of things lost in the dirt, and horse hair when carriages were pulled by horses. Horse hair was used in a lot of different things, and it was easy to come by. So it just reminded me of past and the future and what kind of things people from the over 50 years are for this one.
Thank you for sharing that. That's fascinating. Do you mind telling us, are you a student at AU Arts? Or?
I work with Natalie Gerber.
Oh, great.
Your assistant.
Okay.
I graduated from AU Arts with a bachelor in sculpture. Also helped.
Awesome. Thanks for your question.
Can I respond to that? Thank you for that comment. I've been thinking a lot lately about, because we've got supply chain issues now, which, we really have not ever experienced. And so it's a very interesting experience to go, why isn't that on the shelf? And I want that now, because we live in a culture of now, that it makes me think about times past where production wasn't as massive as it is, or automated, and there wasn't the endless supply of everything at your fingertips. And so it changes the value of something when it's not available. And so I think I love the way that the materials have been transformed in everybody's work here. And, I see that happening, outside of this exhibition too, and work, a lot of contemporary work. And I think we live, I don't know about anybody else, but every day I just feel like I'm battling with stuff. Like there's just so much stuff in our lives, and I'm always trying to get rid of it, but nobody's taking it now either, right? Like thrift stores are turning you away. You can't recycle things. So it really puts into question, where is all this stuff going to go? And what is the archaeological dig going to look like from our era of, life on Earth? So, and anyways, I don't have an answer for that, but it's just kind of what I think about. So thank you.
Actually, there's a good question. I think that Wayne has a question. She says, great exhibition. In a democracy, the majority elects representatives. Do you see yourselves as spokesperson? And if so, of what positions? I thought that was kind of poignant.
I just want to make a note. They're having difficulty hearing us on Zoom.
Are they?
So Clay, maybe you could say that one more time, a little bit louder, and then if we do have other questions from the audience, please project.
Or maybe come up to the mic so we don't have to repeat.
Okay. So, great exhibition. In a democracy, the majority elects representatives. Do you see yourself as a spokesperson? And if so, of what positions?
I think that sort of speaks a little bit to what Louise was saying when you're discussing being a spokesperson of, I would say, sustainability. And when we're talking about supply issues, I can relate to Louise about, I would say probably 6 or 7 years ago. Karen, when you were discussing, or Louise was discussing, buying new materials, we generally, when we have metal to recycle, we can send it off and have that metal recycled for us and turned into another sheet, or you can get your value back in materials. But I got to a point where I was sitting on all this scrap, and you look at it and it's all these past works, like Louise mentioned, things that didn't sell, or things that simply didn't work out the first time you made them, but they have value to them added on top of the metal in your experiences and what you've learned. So I just started using my scrap bin. The only time I really buy metal is if I absolutely need it for a specific component to my work. And I honestly just mine the mistakes, and I mine the pieces that haven't sold and turn them into something else. So I think in a way I can say we're promoting sustainability in recycling and upcycling in the work that we're creating. I don't know if that makes sense to everybody, but for me.
I got a yes.
Okay.
I would say that's such a great question, and I agree. And I guess if I was like thinking about myself on like the soapbox of my practice, which is kind of a really fun way to think about it, I think in a way my stump speech would be about the objects themselves as well as being part of the democracy. That process, that alchemy that happens when you take those everyday things and they become precious through the kind of multifarious dimensionality of experience and life itself, that the objects themselves have things to tell us, and that kind of life that we live with our things can take on kind of a beauty and a poignancy that's really humble, but also really meaningful as well. So I think that my campaign pamphlets would have the voice that we should be also listening to the voice of the object. Yeah.
Natalie?
Hi, everyone. I'm going to try and talk loudly because I'm in front of the class enough that people want to go in front now. But I'm really curious about the role of ephemera and sort of there's this, it seems at least that through your work, time plays an interesting role, and the ephemeral nature is also like really super interesting. And I don't know if I have a coherent question for you. Do you need to go up front?
I think you should do that louder, yeah, sorry.
All right, so I think my question is around sort of the notion of what traditional jewelry is. And if we think of what I think about traditional jewelry, it has a kind of longevity to it. Like the materials that, gold doesn't tarnish and all of this other stuff, that it has this longevity. And the materials that you're all working with has this ephemeral sort of quality to it. Like, I'm not sure how long hot glue stays hot glue-ish, or how long shrink film stays transparent. And so there are all these materials that you're all using that seem to have a time limit. And I guess I'm curious about that time limit in relationship to the work, the practices, and the things that you guys are thinking about. Okay, can we hear that?
Thank you.
I'm remembering to take my mask off this time. I think about that with my work, like every time I box it up and send it to a show, like every time it goes back in a tub, I'm like, this is one more one more year off its like 9 lives or whatever. Because and I think also, when I started making the work too, there was this kind of moment where I was like, okay, here we go. Like, we'll see how long this works out. And I think there's something really lovely about the idea of time and it deteriorating. Like, as you were asking that question, I kept thinking about Eva Hess, and like how her pieces are starting to, they're not the same work, right, that they were in the beginning. And so there's something really lovely about that. And I was also thinking about Jamie's pieces too, like those wood chain links that are kind of burnt. Like eventually there's that metal part still going to be there, but the wood won't be. And like, what will the work be then? But yeah, I think that's part of the like interesting potential of working in this way. It was also a question, I guess. That's such a AU Arts thing. We always like ask questions that we're not really sure. I think this is a comment question.
Can I jump in there?
Please.
Louise from the
Yes.
sky.
I think with my denim pieces specifically, they are playing with that idea of that jeans become more interesting and more fashionable as you wear them in, you know, and with wearing these pieces of jewelry, they're going to wear in as well. And the way I've displayed them is in these frame boxes with a piece of the least distressed part of the jean is underneath. So eventually with the light, with the way they're sitting there, you'll get a shadow where the jeans, the background has faded and where they, so when you're wearing them, you get that. So it's all playing with that idea. But I think it's interesting because all of us started out in metal, well, sort of with metal with jewelry, is that's what the big attraction is. Like when the first time I made a piece of jewelry, a ring, you do a band ring with Sarah Beth, the idea that if we were buried under the ground in a volcano, well, maybe not volcano, but if I was buried under the ground in thousands of years, that ring would still be intact, completely intact. And that is one of the crazy things about jewelry, and making a piece of jewelry is quite a big responsibility because you're stuck with it forever. So it's kind of nice to make something that's not quite so important. I don't know, that sounds crazy. I think also part of this whole thing that's happening is the experience of the pandemic, of being in a situation at the beginning when everyone was locked down. You couldn't go out and get stuff, you couldn't buy things as much. We were all forced to like look at what you've got in your space and use what you have. Using up the food in your cupboard, even, you know, things like that. The idea of just using what you have is really important right now. But I don't see myself as a spokesperson for anything really. That going back to Mireille's question, I am not. When I started, that's why I mentioned, you know, it was partly to do with financial concerns. When I started with sustainable materials, I wasn't like, you know, at the time it wasn't particularly fashionable to be sustainable. It wasn't such a big thing, and I wasn't, my work wasn't about that subject, and it really isn't about that subject. It's not about the environment, my work. It's more about the materials and the meaning behind the materials. And the sustainability is just is a very comforting for me side issue that allows me to not feel guilty about making more stuff. I can hear Shona Ray laughing.
Can I just say something?
Yeah, we have a comment from the audience from Shona. Go ahead.
I just want to say you're the Bob Dylan of the democracy of jewelry movement, my friend. That's what he wasn't trying to be a social.
Right.
He just over there.
I saw another question. Natalie was saying.
This is sort of posted towards Louise. Actually, it's funny that you're talking right now. So I'm curious, because I work in textiles as well, did you see a shift when you started working in textiles rather than metals in how people perceive the value of your work?
That's a difficult question. It's really hard for me to answer that because I have a real problem with my own perception of the value of my work in terms of actually being a product that someone's going to buy. So the prices of my work, yeah, I always price my work based on the labor rather than the material, and especially because I was using anodized aluminum a lot before. That is not an expensive material. It may have been different if I was doing, you know, more traditional silversmithing or gold or gemstones, but I wasn't. So because I've never been that interested in that kind of value. I'm more interested in the ideas always. That's what's exciting for me. So I think, yeah, if anything, I'm a spokesperson for doing things like questioning what is the norms, questioning norms. Let's get outside of what people think jewelry should be or art.
Can I add?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, does anyone else have a comment?
Louise, I'm talking to the sky because your voice is coming from the sky. I think your work is really, from an outsider perspective, your work is super well known because of its materiality and the way you're like treating material and creating form.
Yes, that's nice.
So the material, no, but like, I think because as an outsider who really loves your work, I think like your work is well known because of the choices you made, not just, not, the difference between metal and fiber, right, is the question. Yeah. And I'm thinking because you chose this material and the way you work with it, I think it's actually why you are.
Yeah, I think it's it makes it it makes it more like, I think in this contemporary jewelry world, most of the people who are interested in it are other jewelers or other craftspeople. So with the way I work has been, for jewelers, when they see it in real life, when they see one of my pieces in real life, often the experience is to see it from a distance and not know what it's made from and be confused about what is that. And then they get closer and closer to looking at it. And then they are, sometimes they still can't figure out what it's made of. And then they ask me, and then it's fabric. And it's kind of like, questioning those materials. And then for people who are coming from a textiles background, the way I construct my pieces is very much because my sort of, official training is not in tech. I don't have any textile education. That's all self-taught or passed down through family. So the way I approach textiles is from a metalsmithing point of view, the way I put things together. So it ends up with these objects that kind of skirt on the boundaries on the edges of what jewelry is and what textiles are, but it doesn't really fit into either, which I always like. I like the edges.
Mm-hmm. I might
Karen?
just speak to that, and just going back to the democracy question, and then as well Natalie's question about ephemera. I think in terms of being spokespeople, I don't know that any one of us would want to take that role on, but it's more, an artist's role in society is to reflect what's going on around us. So our choice of materials, I think, has a lot to do with that. And then the ephemera piece too, there's so much of our nostalgia and is digital now, right? Our nostalgic or memory, all of our photographs are in our boxes now, which, once that software is outdated, I don't know how I'm going to access that stuff. And so there's an interesting thing for me that happens in bringing those images back into a physical form. And jewelry, just by its nature, always has that kind of memory and, that real personal kind of relationship to it in terms of what it means to the person that's wearing it and maybe the person who made it. So that was just going through my mind. Thank you.
Thanks, Carrie. There's a couple of, Sarah Beth.
I just wanted to say that in terms of jewelry is on the mark. That's very different than the sculpture. Because we're interacting with the body, and so all of that, all of the ideas, the materiality, the relationships, the memory, if you're wearing it, it changes. And the body as a canvas is so different than an object that's a sculpture or an object that doesn't have to interact with a live person. different. Or even if it's a piece of jewelry, it's very different when it's worn versus when it's sitting in a case.
Thanks, Sarah. Shona?
Well, that just like makes me think about Jamie Croker's pieces, because when I look at them, I see them as objects, and I see the techniques of the jewelry studio in there and the concepts, but the idea of actually wearing them, I don't know, because I've never held one. They look so heavy. They're heavy with her ideas and her concepts of her relationship, as she was saying, to the environment she's walking through, working in, tools she's using. Like, it's just interesting to me as we're talking how all the other objects I saw in the exhibition I can wear, I feel, oh, what would that look like on me? You know? Oh, anyways, but with her, and yeah, they are necklaces, but for whom? Right? And I'm
They're
just,
kind of like a yoke.
yeah, they're heavy.
Yeah.
They're heavy with experience and memory. But I don't know. Just
And if I could add to that too, they're heavy in relationship to the body, because they wouldn't be heavy if you were moving them from one place to another or something.
Are
So,
they heavy?
they look like the heaviness is because of the relationship with the body. I think I'm just expanding on what you were.
Okay.
Yeah, like I think you underlined that point really beautifully, because it's like it's heavy looking, but it feels heavy because the body participates in looking at the jewelry. You're like, oh, I could wear that. What would that look like on me? Oh, that would be heavy. All the like it's kind of, there's that relationship there, and I really appreciate your comment, both of your comments about that relationship, and when you are experiencing it as a viewer, that sense, that scale becomes sort of zeroed in on a, yeah, I think of jewelry as kind of the experience of the miniature, like where it stops time and there's a preciousness about it, and you know, there's a way in which you experience the world that's interior when you're looking at jewelry or contemplating it, as opposed to the kind of outside world. So anyway, thank you both for saying that. It just made me excited. I had to like rip off my mask.
We have a couple questions in the chat.
Yeah. Well, everybody sort of touched on this, but I just thought I'd throw it out. So how would we design and develop in a sustainable way, as climate change is a big topic now, and I know some of you have already touched on that, so that's one question. And actually, there's an extension of that, so we might as well extend on that. It says, how can we support and introduce the adult
Indigenous.
Indigenous art to the society through craft and education?
I think I might just repeat the question so that I'm sure it's easy to understand. The question is, how can we support and introduce the Indigenous art to the society through craft and education? Anybody have any thoughts about that?
I guess I have a few thoughts on that, because I've been thinking about that in terms of my classes. And we invited, Elder Casey came to speak to our class about craft and about Indigenous perspectives on making and education and that relationship. And I definitely can't speak for Elder Casey, but what I learned from him in our conversation was that there is a way in which I guess it occurred to me that about the land acknowledgement and how deeply situated, not just the territory and the place and the history, but in the relationship between making and understanding and living in the world is so connected to the land. And this idea that you make first, you think with your heart first, which allows you to be present, and that relationship with the materials around you allows you to not take too much, or to have a relationship with the things that you are using and thinking about, and just that kind of spiritual presence and exercise of sustainability. And I guess I can't answer the larger question about the larger education, but I think just the experience of having artists like Elder Casey come in and be able to learn and listen, I think that, for me at least, is a really important part. And to be able to understand or be able to think about the way I am in a place, and my relationship to the materials there. I'm not sure that answers the question.
I think in response to that, and I also, when Sarah was talking about, letting the objects decide, I think there is, I guess, maybe a vacancy or an absence of connection, in Western culture or developed places where we're so removed from extraction. It's an extraction of resources like these, even the language around the materials that we use is so separated from their places of origin that there isn't that kind of reverence for how much or how little you should use. And so in terms of sustainability, that's such a huge issue, and I don't know if there's a way back to that at all. I don't see it. I spend a lot of time thinking about these things, but I guess we can do small things, and I think we've all spoken about just valuing what we have and being more conscientious about, what we take. And thank you for sharing those teachings, Sarah. It's a real grief, for me to think about the gap that there is for myself and maybe many others here in this room or other places in terms of that lack of relationship. My husband does a lot of bushcraft, so he'll gather materials and then he'll make, like cordage or another kind of useful item out of the material that he gathers. And it's kind of incredible to me because, we have all these materials that we use to make beautiful things, which enrich all of our lives, but making the material to make the things that we make, like that's a whole other level of making and relationship. So I don't know there's no answer for me, but it's just more, these are the things I think about and wonder about in my process. So.
I just want to kind of build on what Sarah was saying. Like, I think as an educator, we get to operate from this point of privilege, and it's like a really wonderful luxury to be able to talk about ideas and making things all day. And I am fortunate enough in the studio to have quite a few Indigenous students come through the middle studio. So for me, it's about like finding the spark, lighting it, like finding access for like exhibitions and opportunities, and like making sure that, like, as someone that has this kind of, I don't know, whatever I should refer to my visit, but that I have this ability to like kind of facilitate access for students, it's really important to me. So yeah, if anybody has opportunities.
Thanks, Lindsay. There's a couple other questions in the chat that I'd like to turn to. This one's from Annie Tum in Toronto. Hello, wonderful to hear the artists talk about the work and practice. Thank you for sharing. I'd love to hear your thoughts about the future of traditional studio craft education, goldsmith, jewelry practice in relation to sustainability, because they can seem at odds, yet there is a desire to project traditional craft skills. Hope that makes sense. Do you want to touch on that?
Well, I'll just make a quick mention to my work includes both traditional craft making, goldsmithing, metals. I've used and recycled gold, silver, as well as using the alternative materials as well. But as we're discussing sustainability, one of the important things for me in my craft is that my piece lasts, unless I need to tear it apart and make something else. But the ability to inherit a piece of jewelry or pass that jewelry on It's not, we might be using throwaway objects, or I might be using throwaway objects, but the object itself should last for a very long time. That's very important to me. So when we're talking about traditional goldsmithing and where that's where those meet for me, and I find that having a product that is made well is very, very important, a piece of jewelry that has been very carefully considered in the craftsmanship.
And that comes from the tradition of goldsmithing.
Yeah, so when we're learning our traditional metal techniques, yeah, that's where that would come from. So I don't think that will ever change for me. Who knows? But I think it's an important part of my practice anyways. I don't know if that answers that question.
I think you have to know how to make to know how to unmake.
Yeah, true.
Absolutely.
I mean, if you can't sand and file and solder, then you got nothing. So.
And I think to the act of making well-made things, I mean, that hopefully adds to how sustainability in its own way, in the sense that it's not throwaway. And I think that's why all of us in this room and those who are watching love handmade, crafted objects, because they have that depth and the consciousness of being made to them. So maybe that's a good excuse to keep making things. But I think also that's a great question from Annie. Thank you, Annie, for the question. I think it's a big question in the field, maybe. I mean, it's definitely the tension that I feel in my own practice, and part of what the impetus was for this exhibition and this panel. And it's difficult. And then, you know, there's also the kind of DIY, the whole movement of DIY, you know, hobby jewelers and craft artists out there too, that, you know, they're making, you know, side hustle businesses and such. So I don't know how long those materials or items last. I'm not sure, but it's just like we're all making more stuff. So, but for me too, and I think everybody here, I want to make something that lasts. And when you're tasked with that, you know, as a custom jewelry maker, that's what it's for, and it's for handing down the generations. And hopefully that object doesn't end up in a landfill. It's where the stories are held. It's the record keeper of memory and, you know, lineage, maybe, for people that inherit these objects down the line. So anyways, if that addresses it at all.
I was going to say, can I say something?
Yeah.
And I think it links, this is going to be useful to you guys because it's going to link between two. I can see another question in the chat about high school education. So I think when people learn traditional making skills, be that goldsmithing, silversmithing, or how to make a garment, I think what it does is, even if they just learn, you know, make one dress at school or an apron, I think it makes people realize how long it takes to make something and what the actual value of it is. So when I have students start jewelry, their idea of how much a pair of earrings should cost changes very quickly once they realize how much work goes into making a pair of earrings or a ring. And the same with clothes. If you, you know, I've been making my own clothes for a couple of years now. And when I look at the cost of a t-shirt from a fast fashion place, it's crazy to me because I know how long it would take to just cut it out and sew it. So I think that is the value of this education, is not necessarily so that you can then go out and make a living making t-shirts, but so that you can understand how much something is worth and the value of it. And also for me, it's when I see something I want to have online, like a bag or something, and I'm, you know, lusting after this product, it slows me down and makes me think, you know, how much is that thing worth? Can I make it myself with stuff I've already got in this room? Most of the time I can. It's just whether I've got the time to do it. So I think, yeah, that's my answer. It's the question was from, and I think this may be my daughter's high school art teacher, Ariel, asking this question. She's going to teach a art jewelry class for high school students. I'm going to read it. I'm just taking over now. So I'm developing a jewelry course that will absolutely be working with found materials and infusing meaning and value of materials with high school students. What do you feel is the best way to frame alternate jewelry ideation with teenagers to create a fresh generation of makers who have this top of mind? So
Does anyone else have thoughts about that? Yeah.
I think it goes back to what we were talking about with the relationship with the body, in a way where I'm thinking of teenagers and myself as a teenager, and just the way in which there is this constant, the way in which what you wear and how you present yourself, and the kind of way in which that interface between what it is you're wearing and the world becomes really important. And so jewelry is full of that language. And so that way in which where you wear something, what materials, or like where it comes from, or Lindsay and I were brainstorming ideas about just what could be jewelry in its relationship. And I joked about putting a pin back on a skyscraper, on a building, and just attaching yourself to it. And that building is now the piece of jewelry. And so that's where I would go with it, I think, is asking teenagers to think about what it is they say when they wear something.
And I think there's a really great opportunity to create a material awareness through that class, which sounds really exciting, in terms of maybe asking the people who are participating about collecting materials from their daily life. You know, for example, like what Devin's work is a great example of that. But and how, because those materials are everywhere, and you know, how can they see that material differently? So I think there's a great opportunity there, and maybe create some awareness around sustainability, or, you know, there's other things, because if you're talking about art jewelry, often the idea is paramount to the pieces. You know, they're not just pieces of jewelry for fashion, they've got idea and content and you know, a lot of thought that goes into them. So yeah, that sounds like an exciting class.
Yeah, I was going to say, I love I think Sarah said about we haven't really talked about it, is communicate, you know, being able to wear something on your body that communicates something about yourself, and having this kind of secret language. And I think teenagers have always done that, be it with piercings or nail art. There's specific codes that are hidden in some of those things that so you can express something about yourself or identify each other silently, that you're the part of the same group. And I think teenagers would really respond well to that. And the idea of identity and expressing your personal identity, and also feeling part of a group is very important to teenagers. So
this reminds me so much of your work.
Yeah, me too. It reminds me a lot of
The coding, yeah.
I just keep my advice for the high school class is to just like show the juxtaposition between like you know, what's at Tiffany, what's at Claire's, and then like some images of art jewelry, and maybe not even having to say anything, but just letting them absorb that and understand, or like just start to see like the difference between a giant diamond and gold, and then like what happens if you sweep your floor up and hot glue it together and put it on your sweater.
Hey.
No, that's an actual, okay, that's a Lisa Walker piece. I'm just letting you know that's an actual object. Okay.
Go ahead.
One of my biggest influences is Ellen Matussi and Duchamp. I think about agency. And if you guys think about that when you're working in found materials or any kind of material, about how is the agency with you as an artist, or is it being transferred to the material as it's being presented and sort of put out there, and how do you see people responding to it? Whether I mean, everybody's going to respond differently, whether it's about how they're going to wear it, or how they're going to view it, or how the material was being used, but I think Devin, something about what you were doing really just sparked that whole thing. It's a question about agency again, sort of power, and talisman and that. And so it's just something I'm really interested in. I'm just wondering, maybe you have thought about that when you were putting together your pieces for the exhibition.
No, go ahead. I was just thinking as you were asking that question that I think about material as like language, and so like anything I put in, I think of as like a way to like create a narrative in the object. So I'm like, each material is like a word, and then together they will become a paragraph, and my idea will get across somehow. Because I'm not really that great at writing, some of you know in this room. But yeah, I feel like it's like my way of creating narrative or creating a story. So yeah, I hope I'm embedding the material with meaning. That answers your question?
I think
No.
so, yeah.
Okay. I think I did this. I think I took a right turn. Okay, someone else go.
I think I'm just wondering what you mean by agency.
Yeah, I guess, you know, it's taking the material and making something like, earlier you talked about taking something that's useless and making it valuable. And I'm just thinking about how, like, what's the value in that? Like you think about Duchamp's urinal, right? Are you guys now seeing that material as being something that's actually supposed to sort of send a message, right? Rather than just being, see what I'm saying? Maybe I'm not making myself.
No, I think that makes sense. So for me, the choice of using those specific objects was specific to a situation that had happened. So to a moment in my life. So each object sort of has its own meaning on its own, but then it takes on a different meaning when I look at it in conjunction to something that I was experiencing at the time. So I think, like, when you say, is someone else gonna see or take that value, I think when you're speaking about things like grief and sorrow or objects that you might look at, see, and the objects that I used, it's interesting that I held on to them because I think I probably, based on the experience around them, would have thrown them away, but I didn't. I held on to them, and they ended up sort of taking on a life of their own. But in having conversations, and I think this is when people connect with all different kinds of art, it has to do with the story and connecting with the artist or with the piece. So I think in some instances, well, in a lot of instances, when you really discuss the work, the core of the work, people are gonna find a value perhaps in their own experience and something along that lines, but also maybe not, often not. I think it just really depends on what your piece is about and what the person has also maybe experienced themselves. And if you have that conversation, because a lot of the times if you're not having that conversation with the artist, you're maybe reading an artist statement and just looking at the work and then having to sort of translate on your own. So I guess it's really hard to say. We just send them out there. Maybe people get it, maybe they don't. I don't know.
I think oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Oh, okay. You know, with Devin's work, like you see it and you know they're bread ties, but they're not either. I mean, I think the repetitive element of so many of them together and the way that they're stacked, you know, you can't see the obvious profile of them, is that changes them. But I think that's just, yeah, the meaning of it and the context changes those objects, you know, and I think the impetus, again, for me, with those DIY craft kits, you know, when you buy them in the ready-made boxes, you only get so much material and you get the colored links, and, you know, they're ready-made kits. And so they also have ready-made images on the shrink film. And so I just think about how much, you know, they're for kids. And so when those are produced, they're kind of generic, right? I mean, there's only so many endings that those kits can have in a way. And so, but then by my using that same material and taking it in a different direction, and I could have used the pre-determined images as well and done something different, but I think that was where, there's this tension for me in terms of as a jewelry maker, and one that makes a living as a jewelry maker in the world, making, precious metal jewelry. There's this kind of tension where it's like, what has value, what does have value, and what is long lasting. And it doesn't necessarily have to do with the materials. I think it is that meaning that we put into it. So yeah.
I don't know if that helped.
No, it does.
What your question makes me think about is when I think about agency and objects, and I think about the time spent making it. And we were talking about this before, in which like that time is one of the most precious materials that we have, and to be able to spend the time in the process of making the work feels like I'm exercising a kind of agency myself in a way. Like I think if somebody was paying me minimum wage to make this hot glue thing, I'd be alienated from it. but because I have the very scarce luxury of time and I use it on the material, I feel like that investment brings kind of my experience of working alive in a way that not very many people get to experience, and that the object, that I also can't help but think that that's reflected in the object. And so I think that I was just talking to Kate about this, I was at a talk once where somebody said, he was a photographer, and somebody said about photography being a radical art. And he said, no, craft is the most radical of art forms. He said, it's inefficient, it's unnecessary, and totally uncalled for. And I was like, oh yeah. And so anyway, so the word agency sparked me to that way in which the time is more valuable than gold these days almost. And the exercising your agency in service of spending your time in the way you choose for something that's in the cause of, yeah, it feels like I'm exercising an agency. I often think that I'm exercising privilege more than agency, but that's an ongoing struggle that I have. Anyway, thanks.
I'm afraid, speaking of time, we need to wrap things up. It's 3:30. I really just want to thank you all so much. Thank you, Louise. Thank you, Jamie, for preparing your materials. This was wonderful. I feel very excited. My brain is firing. I'm inspired, and it really means a lot to me that you took the time to be here. So I'd like to thank you all on behalf of the Alberta Craft Council. I'd also like to thank everyone in the audience who took the time to come today and on Zoom. Thank you so much for joining us. I just want to mention a couple of things about the Alberta Craft Council. We have 2 great shows here in Calgary, Democracy of Jewellery, and we also have an exhibition of our 2021 awards recipients. That's on, both shows are on now until March the 5th in the Calgary location of C-Space. In Edmonton, we have a wonderful show called Tissues that is on until March the 12th. It's a textile artist who graduated from AU Arts Fiber Department. And also just wanted to let you know that we do offer memberships. There are memberships for artists, free memberships for students, hint, and memberships for artists, and also collectors and customers and supporters, business organizations. We do have some of those forms here today if you're interested in signing up, or you can always go to our website and check out our membership there. And I think that's everything. Thanks to everyone for helping.